We are the characterization of custom made carbon fiber tubing group for the ME401 test engineering class. Our group members are Benjamin Ellis, Nicholas Thurich, Jordan West, Tyler Brooks, and Andrew Pohl. Our test objective is to characterize the strength of our student made carbon fiber composite tubes that are made in the composites lab. We are looking at the relation of the strength to the winding angle. Our key question was what winding angle would produce the highest yield strength and how variable is the winding process. This slide is covering some background on why this ME401 team chose to investigate the carbon fiber tubing. We are all part of the Clarkson University rocketry team. Collegiate rocketry teams often use composite winding for the manufacture of their rocket bodies and various other tubes that are involved in the construction. Throughout the rocket's flight, it experiences a variety of forces, including drag, motor thrust, and G loading, which puts a high load of compressive force on the structure. We wanted to better understand what force our tubes can actually withstand and how does that vary based on winding angle, which is not very well understood by the rocketry team at the moment. This slide is summarizing our test plan and design of experiment. Our test plan was to actually compress our in-house made carbon fiber tubing at different winding angles to determine its corresponding strength. For this, we chose three winding angles: 45, 60, and 30. Our 45-degree wind angle was our control for this test, as that is commonly what the rocketry team winds at. For this, we chose to do a variety of tube sections based on how much tube we were able to make and also the size of the tubing samples we cut. Our expected failures was that the 45 would be our middle failure point, but hopefully within 10% of all the other 45-degree tubes, roughly. Our 60-degree would be our lowest failure loading, but within hopefully 10% of the other 60-degree tubes. And our 30 would be our highest failure loading, but within 15% of the other 30-degree winding angle tubes.
Overall, there are four major flows to this flow chart. First, we need to create the carbon fiber tubes. Secondly, we need to cut these tubes to length and then insert them into our test frame. And then also, finally, once in test frame, we need to do our compressive tubes to destruction. So overall, we're compressing our tubes of all sections until we yield into a fracture. This fracture is predetermined by a sensitivity of around 40% of total loading onto the tube. And once we hit that 40%, it will stop. Then the software that we use will then record this data and then we'll repeat for other tubes, export all of the data. And then from there, we then post-process that data to get the overall yield strength of each one. Overall, there are two sets of variables, one that we are controlling and the other one we are leaving to be variable. The overall load generated onto the test cells or the test tubes are obviously a variable that stems from the compression of the tube. Our tube geometry is variable with regards to inner and outer diameter. This is due to certain defects in the tube. We are assuming in our test calculations that these are that are equal per tube. However, we can't 100% control this just due to manufacturing errors. And then overall, our sigma yield, which is our yield strength within each tube. Theoretically, these should all be the same, but with regards to our variables that we can't control, these will be slightly different. And then overall, things that we can control are the type of test, which is our compressive test, the rate at which we are loading these tubes, which is 250 newtons per meter, and a stop condition. There is a typo on this slide. It should be around a 40% decrease in load, which is our sensitivity value, but right now it says 20. The overall measurement techniques is that the force applied and displacement measured is done through our load cell. So it records and measures the forces applied in terms of our load variable, and then the displacement in terms of compression. The proper length and internal diameter of the tubes was measured via calipers, and these are also inputted into the software so that we can understand yield stresses, and yield strains. Now I will be going over the test equipment for the overall study. We are using an Incitron 4505 load frame, and we're doing multiple sets of different tube samples. With respect to each sample, we have a 45-degree set, a 30-degree set, and a 60-degree set. These tubes were made on our X winder. It is a fiber wound winding CNC device, which allows us to control the wind angle, overall geometry of the tube, and material choice. So we decided to go forward with our carbon. And so we're going to be inputting these sample tubes depending on the angle of which we're winding into the Incitron and doing compressive testing and get until we get a fracture point. Overall, it was a pretty simple setup. The only change that we had was in the top right hand corner. You can see that there are two silver platens that are basically just holding the tubes in place. Those needed to be custom milled and allowing us to have a better compression face for the tubes. I'll quickly go over the relevant calibration and standards. So overall, for us to get a better understanding of the load cell, we needed to definitely calibrate it to make sure that everything is coming out as expected. So these calibration of the load cell was done periodically. So the load cell was calibrated via us, and there is a custom and Incitron themselves will come and calibrate it themselves periodically throughout the years. So we have a double calibration system so that we allow it to make sure that all of our data that is being outputted is accurate. And then if this is properly done, this is properly done by our lab professionals as well. But we are doing our own test loading so that we understand calibration via step ups and step downs.
Our process description is as follows. We generated the winding patterns with the X-Winder designer for the tubing. We prepared the mandrel with a mix of Mylar and also PVA release film. We would then mix the low viscosity laminating epoxy for the resin bath based on what the X-Winder would say for the actual carbon fiber required. We would then wind the carbon fiber filament around the mandrel using the X-Winder, and in this process, it is actually pre-impregnated with the epoxy bath that then runs onto the mandrel. We then would apply the heat shrink tape and heat the mandrel and heat shrink tape to compress the tape onto the mandrel, squeezing the excess epoxy out. We would then allow 12 to 24 hours of cure time, um, and after we would remove the mandrel or remove the carbon fiber from the mandrel and then cut it down to size. From here, we would mount the sample to the test fixture, apply increasing axial force until the material would fail, and then we would repeat for how many samples we have, and then we analyze the test results for correlations. This photo is showing a example setup of what it looks like when the X-Winder is fully prepared for a test wind. As you can see, the fiber runs from the large spool on the back through several pulleys into the epoxy bath, up, and then out the mandrel, where it is then attached to the mandrel, which is covered in the pink vacuum bagging at the moment. Unfortunately, with this test, we found out the vacuum bagging was not the best material, and you do need to use Mylar in order to be able to effectively wind and remove the tube after it is dried. Our procedure is as follows. So our first step was to generate the winding patterns for the tubing using the X-Winder. Next, preparing the X-Winder mandrel by coating in the PVA mold release as well as wrapping in the Mylar film. Our third step was mixing the required quantity of low viscosity laminating epoxy and filling the said resin bath. We would then wind the carbon fiber filament around the mandrel using the X-Winder. After this, we would feed the heat shrink tape onto the tubing and heat the tape to compress it onto the fiber and allow it to force some of the excess epoxy out of the composite. We would then cut samples from the stock material after it had been cured for approximately 12 to 24 hours, mount the sample in the text fixture after it was cut, and then apply steadily increasing force until the sample would fail. We would record the values of compression as well as take pictures to analyze the failure modes. We would repeat the manufacturing process for each sample and then analyze the results to determine our correlations.
So here you can see our test plan for the semester. It's broken up into 4 individual phases. Our first phase is coming up with the general requirements and plan for what we want to test. Our second phase is our data analysis plan and setting up our experiment and finding out what we want to get out of it and really honing in on the requirements from the first phase. Our third phase is actual testing and analysis. Um, so testing, getting our results, and analyzing them, and then our final phase is coming up with our final deliverables based on the results of our tests. Here you can see the budget that we came up with for our test plan for the semester. Um, we actually didn't end up using any of this because we were able to find supplies around um, that we didn't have to pay for because they were already in our possession and in the lab. So we didn't end up using any of this budget, but this is the approximate cost of our test campaign.
For our risk assessment, our potential risks and hazards were exposure to carbon fiber and epoxy resin when making the actual tubing. For this, our controls and mitigations were wearing proper PPE as well as being in a ventilated um, clean room that is currently used in the composites lab. Our other potential risks and hazards were the actual testing, where we could see some sort of carbon or epoxy shrapnel from the failure. For this, we had proper PPE, including safety glasses, as well as a plexiglass guard on the front of the load frame and another guard on the back of the load frame.
So here we can see our test setup as viewed from the back. The the actual sample being tested is in the middle right here, and then the 2 custom platens for the compressor testing are both above and below the sample in the load frame. And then the load cell is right here.
As can be seen in our results table, our 30-degree winding angle had the highest mean failure load at 2290 newtons, as well as our highest mean sigma yield at 72.24 megapascals. However, this dataset does have a very high standard deviation, which was due to some manufacturing defects that will be discussed in a later slide. Our 45-degree winding angle tube was the middle strength value, which was expected based on our hypothesis, with a mean failure load of 2260 newtons and a mean sigma yield of 70.79 megapascals. This tube had a better standard deviation of approximately 10.7 megapascals, which would further be reduced by adding more data to this data set. Our winding angle of 60 degrees, as we suspected in our hypothesis, was the lowest failure load at 1568 newtons with a sigma yield of 35.6 and our standard deviation of 9.71, which is very close to the 10 we got with the 45, indicating that this is a fairly reliable data set. Starting on the y-axis of the graph, graph, you can see we have sigma yield in megapascals, and the x-axis is in winding angle in degrees. We can see we have plotted our three mean values for our 30, 45, and 60-degree angle tubes. You can see the relationship is such that as winding angle increases, sigma yield decreases. Unfortunately, due to manufacturing defects that were discussed in other slides, the 30-degree angle tube had a fairly high standard deviation, and as such, we expect the mean value to actually be much higher. Therefore, we did not do any sort of linear regression or plot analysis to figure out the direct relationship between winding angle and sigma yield as we had initially thought, due to the fact that we think this 30-degree data point is not accurate to what we would expect it to be. As was discussed in our other slides, the results were as we had expected in our initial hypothesis that the 30-degree winding angle had the strongest mean sigma yield, with a 45 relatively closely behind it, and the 60-degree angle had the weakest sigma yield value. As can be seen in the right picture is an example of our test setup in our compressive load frame. And then, as I had been discussing in other slides, our manufacturing defect with our 30-degree tubes, as can be seen on the left-hand side picture, there is a large gap in the tube that was caused purely by the winding style of the X winder and the slip coefficient of that winding angle. For uncertainty analysis, we know that there was uncertainty associated with our low sample size. We had an average sample size of approximately 6 or 7 tubes per winding angle. This was due to us not being able to manufacture as many tubes as we would have liked due to running out of supplies to use on the X winder, as well as some difficulties in general associated with using the X winder as pictured below. We also know that the caliper has some uncertainty associated, but we assumed it would be minimal in comparison to other errors. We also know that the 30-degree winding angle had a very large standard deviation due to the manufacturing defects, and as such, that would have a very high uncertainty associated with it. Other uncertainties that we may have encountered were uncertainties associated with the load frame. Unfortunately, we were not given the calibration curves for the load frame, and so we were not able to figure out exactly how much error we had associated with our test, but we expected to be relatively minimal.
So the analysis and conclusions from our test. Our study aimed to answer what the proper winding pattern was for our carbon fiber tubing, specifically when it's in axial compression for the loading scenario. We discovered that through our tests, winding angle of 30 degrees is the strongest for withholding this type of load, followed by 45 degrees and then followed by 60 degrees in that order. However, our study did have its limitations. There were some pretty significant manufacturing defects in the samples that we created, and also a relatively low sample size. So if we're able to do this again and do it better, we would essentially make a lot more samples and do a lot more work to reduce the manufacturing defects that were present. Despite these limitations, our findings do have some really important implications and impacts by giving us more insight as to initially how these different winding patterns can affect the strength of these materials. And moving forward, we future research in this for us would be looking how to eliminate these manufacturing defects and then also just polish up the manufacturing process a little bit more. And just to finish up, we would like to acknowledge and thank Professor Hoover and our teaching assistant Sandeep for all of their work helping us out this semester.